As you're all aware, the global food system will experience unprecedented pressures over the next 40 years. On the demand side, global population is increasing, there's a rising demand for meat and dairy products, and globally there's a steady upward trend in the average number of calories that are being consumed. On the production side, this competition for land, water and energy will all intensify. The productivity of certain crops has plateaued in parts of Europe. In many parts of the world, agricultural soils are severely degraded, and the effects of climate change are already having impacts on supply chains. So what lies behind the question that we're debating this evening is whether, in the context of all of these factors, we can maintain the high level of food security that the UK currently enjoys.
There's no doubt that our understanding of sustainability is changing. So if you look at this particular sector of food and agriculture, the last 10, 15 years, the discourse has been about certification as the way to deliver sustainability, demonstrate sustainability. I think the last couple of years, there's enough discussions going on that's taking people beyond auditing as a way of delivering upon sustainability. So we get into the social issues, human rights, and looking at impacts and how we address these deep-rooted issues like deforestation and child labour.
The UK, obviously the food system is not a little, we're not isolated in an island now with our food system, so we're global. And I think this has really important implications because there's a lot of advocacy around certain systems of production in the UK. So, for example, you take the somewhat protectionist perspective that says the UK and other countries in northern regions are going to be relatively less badly affected by climate change. So we have a moral imperative to produce lots more food to feed the starving millions who can't produce their food because climate change is going to hit them hard, which is really a form of imperialism by another name. We have to look at the UK food system within the context of this very leaky global system, and work out what we do here and what its impacts are on the rest of the world.
Increasing food production by 60% by 2050 is no small task. And against that, we had the recent assessment report by SEC, Working Group 5, looking at 2050 average decline of crop yields across Africa and South Asia of 8% on average, but some crops will be affected much worse than that. And they concluded that it's very likely that changes in temperature and precipitation will lead to food price increases of between 3 and 84% by 2050.
I just wanted to make one follow-up point though on the question of the role of the food system and food companies in tackling climate change, that it's not an either-or question, and in fact the fact that a lot of the food sector is going to be heavily impacted by climate change, wouldn't it be great for them to be coming out and helping to build pressure on action in other sectors? Food insecurity in the UK is obviously, I don't think it's so much a production issue, it is much more about a range of other factors, including low wages, insecure work, the culture of 0 hours contracts, for example.
There is absolutely no doubt that the food industry is one of the sectors that is going to be most affected by climate change. No doubt. And I take the point that Penny made that, Tara, 22–24% of emissions are from land use change, half of that agriculture, half of that is deforestation. That still leaves 78%, which is from fossil fuels. And I think we should just bear that in mind when we start putting all the emphasis onto the food system and how the food system is going to tackle climate change. I think the other thing to say, and the IPC said it, is that climate change is just one of a series of issues. And the context around those issues are including technology, population, demographics, governance. And they couldn't find which one of those was most important. They just said it's part of the mix. And actually any one of those other things may well be more important in the immediate and medium term than climate change itself when it comes to the food system.
The more we do to address the demand, the more ecological space there is for doing other things with our land. And that gives us choices. and giving up, and choice is inherent to the notion of resilience. And I see climate mitigation as an outcome of a better, more resilient food system rather than the only single-minded goal, because sometimes when you hit the target, you miss the point. I do think that one of the very, very simplest ways in which we can actually achieve a range of goals for the food system is to cut down on our animal product consumption, and that includes meat and dairy products. I think it would be misguided and also unhelpful to conclude that climate is so important that we should throw everything out alongside it, because if we take into account things like pleasure and nutrition and cultural value food and everything else, then you're actually taking people with you and politicians with you to get, because shouting at them doesn't seem to work. So we have to find ways of going in the right direction.
Watershed management in Peru has seen potato yields increasing from 850 kilograms to 3,930 kilos a hectare. Intercropping, growing mutually beneficial species together, has seen 158% increases in bean yields in Kenya. And looking at different conservation agricultural techniques such as reducing nose leach, the integration of organic material into soil rather than clearing off the land, has increased soil yield by 83% in Brazil. So there's so many great case studies out there of techniques that can be applied. I think the challenge is then how to get that information and share that knowledge at the smallholder communities.
I would challenge pain as well, and NGOs and civil society in general. I do wonder whether behind the brands which is going after 10 companies and is using this race to the top theory that you go after a few and everyone will race that. I don't know if that's working. I really don't. I don't see all of those 10 companies racing to the top. I'd see half of them, or less maybe. And I think you've got to find a way to challenge the broader range of companies. When I was in Rio, and actually I think a few things did come out of it. I think there was a very clear call from governments from companies that they want governments to set the rules of the game. I'm not going to say all the easy stuff has been done by companies, but a lot of the easy stuff has been done. And the next big movements and steps forward are actually going to be made by governments changing things. So for example, if we think that we should be creating more jobs and we should be reducing impacts on resources, then let's change the taxation system away from taxation of labour to taxation of resources. And then finally, I think for consumers, Tara's talked about consumers choosing products with lower impacts and better nutrition. But will consumers pay more for the food? Because ultimately, if you want to take slavery out of your supply chains, it's going to cost money. And someone's got to pay for that.
There's only a number of leading companies that are really doing quite a lot on some of these sustainability issues, but many who are not doing so much. I guess it's in the interest of those that are showing leadership in this area to have more of a level playing field through regulation that government can put in place. It's the role of organisations like Oxfam and other civil society organisations to put pressure through public campaigning and media attention on laggards in industry, and how you create incentives for your suppliers and invest in them to meet the kind of sustainability standards that we are talking about here. Obviously, from government's perspective and on the demand side, in terms of food security for people, there's a big agenda there in tackling inequality, extreme wealth, extreme poverty, the widening gap that we're seeing and that you've probably heard organisations like Oxfam talk about, but also POPEs and increasingly the IMF, the World Bank, more unusual suspects highlighting this issue of rising inequality, and that has massive impacts on the sustainability of the food system, particularly from a social perspective, and that's something we'd like to see tackled. It's rising at the agenda. It's, that's in terms of the debate that are being had there, but that's really a rising issue. And I think that we're seeing in the UK, for example, an increasing focus on these issues.
I think with something as multifaceted as the food system and the chain of consumption, I think one important thing to point out is that although my focus purposes of this evening is on consumption, it's part of three things we need to do. We need to produce differently, we need to consume differently, and we need to rebalance and make more equitable the food system. So I think we need to see it within that context. It's not an either-or thing, and I think that gives it a certain legitimacy. And I think we need to be looking at the things that you can do. So I think you've got regulatory changes, you've got fiscal changes, you've got the role of industry in doing stuff of its own, and then you've got all these soft stuff of, you know, information, education and so forth. So
multifaceted, I suppose. I mean, Oxfam is involved in researching and tracking food prices in developing countries and also issues of access to food over time. So we are kind of tracking that. And that would be one key indicator. You know, obviously looking at what happens over the next 18 months or so in the climate change debate, which we've talked a lot about climate change. There's the Banking Climate Summit happening in September, which gives them an important political signal, you know, looking ahead to the Paris COP at the end of next year. And I think everybody's hoping that we'll see some new, more ambitious commitments there, and looking for kind of signs of building pressure across all the key stakeholders towards that happening.
The direction is that advertising is persuading us to consume more. Food waste is a marker of inadequate appreciation of the value of the food that we consume, and the rising costs are a reflection of the fact that we expect our food to be cheap. The cost of food relative to everything else is very much framed by what we expect of a good life in itself. And my big policy thing is we need to cut back on meat and dairy consumption.
My one food policy ask is actually a bit bigger than food policy. It relates back to what I said on non-financial reporting. I think the moment that we're able to make explicit and put a value on externalities, that is going to change behaviour dramatically. So I think that the conversations we're having with enough companies suggest that the business sector is up for this. The question is government ready to legislate or help support it?
There's some common themes that have emerged in relation to a real ask and request of government for leadership and steer on this issue. There's also been a whole set of discussions around the role of business and business leadership in supporting their customers and consumers to move on and change their behaviours in relation to some of these questions. And we've repeatedly touched on sort of consumption and demand side dimensions of the debate.